This week on the BackTable podcast.
My advice would be, when you have the time, to remember why you went into urology and find something that fills up your cup. Maybe it's research, maybe it's not. Maybe it's wellness efforts, but other things that are related to work but aren't specifically clinical duties that help you remember why you're there and what you're excited about. And I think that just makes all parts of residency better when you have something connected to it that you really care and are excited about.
Hello, good evening, everyone. This is Gina Badalato from Columbia University. I am solo tonight. Lindsay Hansen is not able to join us, but I am delighted to have Dr. Kate Dwyer from Vanderbilt join us tonight to talk a little bit about the importance of peer review for residents during their training. And good evening, Kate. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Excited to be here.
First of all, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your life and your stage of training and what you're looking towards for your career.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Rochester, Minnesota. Did all of my training in Minnesota, so undergraduate in St. Paul, and then medical school and a dual degree in health law and bioethics at the University of Minnesota. Residency, now fourth year, time flies, but is my first time venturing out. I'm now in Nashville, Tennessee at Vanderbilt, as you mentioned, and I'm hoping to get involved in academics, hoping to stay in academics for my future career, and so peer review has fit very well into that.
Yeah, I think this is so important. I think that residents may struggle with this, how to get their foot in the door, or really just grapple with why this is relevant to their future careers, whether they want to stay in academics or not. So why do you think it's important for trainees to get involved in the peer review process?
I think it's important for a couple of reasons, and it depends a little bit on who you are, what your goals are. In general, for me, I think as a resident, there are a lot of competing things going on, primarily clinical duties, just a lot of call, a lot of time in the hospital. But at the end of the day, we're trying to be urologists who practice evidence-based medicine and who are looking at what's coming out and evaluating it. And at some point, you have to create the habit of looking at the literature and kind of learning how to do that quickly and effectively. And peer review is a good way to practice that, especially as a resident. So if this is the time that we're learning how to evaluate the literature, there's journal clubs and things, but it's not a regular activity. But if you do peer reviews and then also involve your mentors and get feedback and things like that, it's a really good time to hone that skill.
For sure. And I think, understanding the literature, staying abreast of the literature, and applying that to practice is so important, regardless of whether you're pursuing a career in academics or in practice. So this is a great way to kind of be a little bit more hands-on, involved, and critical of that process. How did you get involved? How did you get your foot in the door? Tell us a little bit about your first time hearing about this or being invited to do a review. How did that occur?
Yes, so I think it's relatively common here that an attending will receive an invitation to do a review and do it with a resident. I may have done that sometime before third year, but the formal introduction to me was the end of my PGY2 year. I do not claim to be someone who was successfully involved in research for my first and second years of residency. I was very focused on learning urology and getting my feet under me. Yeah. And at the end of my second year, one of my chiefs, George Koch, you know him, gave his chief talk about peer review and then invited us all to join him in signing up to be peer reviewers. And at the time, I was like, okay, that's great. The PGY4s and Rising 5s can do that. They probably know enough to sign up for that. I obviously don't. Like, I can hand irrigate really well, but I can't evaluate literature. That's not going to happen. And I later had a conversation with him where he said, by the time you're a third year resident, and I think it can be true in your junior years as well, but you really are developing expertise. And if not fully formed, you know where to get the information. And you have people and resources around you to make intelligent commentary on lots of things related to urology. So it felt to me at the time like a very early introduction, but it worked out okay. I did sign up, offered to be a reviewer independently. Since that time, I've continued to do reviews with attendings and then some separate on my own. The first time I did a review, I sent it to a more senior person and had them give me feedback on it. And even now, when I get a review that I feel like I have some background in, but maybe I don't fully understand the landscape, or maybe I don't know all of the literature well enough, I'll ask questions. I've called people before and asked, do you think this topic fits into where the field is? Do you think this is where things are headed? Is it relevant? Is it new? And that's been really helpful to me.
Awesome. I can only picture at the end of your PGY 2-year when you're kind of in the trenches handling consult. This was the furthest thing from your mind. But the Chief Talk, for people that haven't heard of it at Vanderbilt, is like your capstone presentation, right? When you graduate, the message that you want to send. And so you gave that talk, and it sounds like it inspired you. What do you mean you signed up? Like, describe to our audience what that entails. How do you even express your interests?
Yes. So that was also surprising to me. I just sent an email to the journals that I was interested based on their content and reputation and things, saying that I would be interested in offering my time as a reviewer. At the time, I think I thought of it more as a vetting process, that maybe I won't get it. Maybe this won't be something that I can do. But what I found out is that journals really do want reviewers, and you aren't alone when you're doing a review. You'll have other folks who are reviewing it with you, and your time can be valuable as an addition to that. So the offer was met with a big welcome.
I can totally understand that. I think, so I got involved during my research year as a PGY 4, and it was just my mentor at the time was Jim McKiernan, and he's like, I'd like you to help with these reviews. And it's a humbling experience because you may feel, especially as a resident or a trainee, that you don't have the authority to critique somebody else's work. But it's helpful not to think of it that way, but to think about, how can I make this stronger? What questions would I have as a trainee or like third party looking at this that can help the authors clarify their message? And when I thought about it that way, it seemed less intimidating. And as you're saying, many times when you're getting involved, you might do this with a faculty member. So the faculty member may get an invitation and they can say to that journal, like, I'd like to review this with a resident reviewer as well. And you would get credit for that and added to their database as a reviewer, but the faculty member would ultimately have some oversight in editing it. And so that's one way to get involved. And then some residents sometimes gain a lot of expertise and you see that they're submitting papers on certain topics. And so the section editors may turn to residents who have expertise in this area to independently review based on that, or based on the fact that they've successfully completed some reviews with faculty members. And then, as you're saying, like, this is labor intensive, this is time intensive to do a thoughtful review. And so it matters that you do a good job and you think about it and you care about it. And good reviewers can come from pretty much any tier or stage of training. So if you prove yourself and get involved, you build a reputation with that journal, with that editor, and it just cascades over time. So how would you what would you say, what is the framework when you're thinking about doing a good peer review? What would you suggest to a trainee to think about? How should they structure their comments? How should they think about it to be helpful to the editor and to the authors? How do you organize your thoughts?
I think there's a lot of ways to do it. Now that I've done several reviews, I've seen my own, and then I've been able to read through what is sent back from other reviewers. So the first thing I would say is it's okay to freestyle a little bit. For me personally, learning how to do it, the first thing I always do is consolidate my own thoughts about the paper. So identifying what kind of study it is, identifying, so it's retrospective, it's prospective, single institution, multiple institutions, and just kind of put that context down of what kind of study I'm looking at, and then outline their major conclusions. I don't know that that's necessarily feedback to the folks who have written the paper. but certainly helpful for the editors as they're going back to as a quick way to understand exactly what type of paper it is. And then after that, I personally usually divide it into two sections. One is major content edits, so something that would require more time. A question that I had that I didn't feel like was adequately answered, or something that could be explained, even if it's just truly that I didn't understand it, it could be explained better to be better understood by more people, those kinds of things. And then I usually have a second section for minor edits. It's not really the time to do wordsmithing and spell check, but if I see it, I feel like it's worth including those things. So I usually have a separate section for that.
Awesome. And then do you ever there's a section where you can send confidential comments? Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about how that's utilized and what type of comments would go in that area?
Yeah, so there's a section that goes specifically back to the folks who wrote the paper, and that's sort of what I've described. There's a separate section that says if there's any things or comments you would like to make to the editors to help them make their decision. And I do frequently use that section because I like to make sure that I filled out all the boxes, for one thing. But also, I think your framing can be slightly different. So to the person who wrote the article, I might say, I didn't understand this, or how does this fit in? It certainly could be that it fits in and I just missed the message. And then to the editor, I'll say, it looks like the literature sits at this point. It may or may not add. If they change this, or if there is more commentary on this, then it would make sense, which I think can give further context to the editors as well.
Yes. As somebody who is an editor, I definitely read read those confidential comments also, just to get sometimes a frank take from the reviewer about what they were confused about, and what their concerns are with the revisions. So I think that's helpful as well. How has your involvement in the peer review process informed your own research? Do you feel like it's framed how you approach your research, or how you submit or structure a paper when you submit your manuscripts?
I think it has. I think there are consistently things that I appreciate when I'm reading through a paper about headings and how things are structured and the clarity of the writing and things like that, citations that just make it easy to read, that now I think I'm more thoughtful about. And I also spend more time as a reviewer. Sometimes I actually have to do background research, but trying to understand where the field is and how this adds. So when I'm writing something, I want to have a very clear vision for myself of, this is exactly where I want to slot. This is where the field is going, and this is what I'm trying to show you. And I think having that clarity of what would be unique or useful to be published has been helpful. I remember talking to a colleague of mine who had just gotten back a review and essentially was reading through it and didn't know how to respond. I think that reviewer might have used the format that I use, where they summarize the article. And she was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to say to that. And it's nice to be familiar with being on the other side, like, oh yeah, I structure it the same way. They're just trying to show you that they understood your article and what you were trying to get across. You don't have to respond to that. So even just knowing the ins and outs of the process and what editors are thinking has been helpful.
Totally. That's so well said. I remember, again, thinking back to my training as a medical student, I had submitted so many papers and many of them didn't get very far, and you don't understand that logic, and you don't know what happens, what the process is like and how it's reviewed. And then it's almost like pulling back the curtain to understand what's happening in the background, what questions people are asked, how they're critiquing it. Sometimes these journals give you a rubric on exactly what you mentioned, on how to approach it and comment on it. And it makes the process, at least it demystifies it, and it helps you from both angles. It helps you grow as a reviewer, and it helps you kind of be thoughtful when you're submitting your work in the future. What do you think are kind of like common pitfalls that people have when they're submitting a review, or even just in your experience reading the reviews you're getting? Like, what are things that you want that residents should look out for or think about or avoid when they're kind of dipping their toe in this water and submitting their first review?
I think the first thing I think of is there's all these jokes online about reviewer number 2, like just coming
Is it
out of
2
the
or
blue.
3?
And yeah, like reviewer number 1 was great. And reviewer number 2, I don't like, they were so mean. And I think now being on the other side of it, it has a lot to do with your approach. And the advice that was given to me was you're not like grading a paper. You're not trying to critique harshly what they've produced. You can almost think of yourself as a collaborator, as someone who's looking at this. You want it to contribute to the literature. You want it to be a good thing, and you want it to advance. So as you're giving your comments, you frame them as, these would be helpful changes, rather than thinking of it as a harsh critique.
Yeah, I think that's important, to be kind and to think of yourself almost as a jury of their peers, a collaborator, like a judge. And most of the time, however painful reviewer number 2 might be, that person actually cared to sit down and clarify their, to write clearly their thoughts to help make the paper better. And many times, 9 times out of 10, those revisions do make the paper better. So I think that's good advice. The one thing that's challenging about this process is that you don't necessarily get feedback on how you're doing as a reviewer. You might get a note from the journal like, thank you for your time, or this helped me make the decision. We are revising this paper. Rarely you could get the paper back after the revisions are made, or the editor might make that decision. How do you calibrate or get a pulse on whether you're doing a good job or not?
It's hard. The first time I sent one in, I felt like I had spent a lot of time on it. I really had no idea if that's what they wanted or not. The first thing that is really helpful is receiving all of the other reviews and then seeing if you picked up on what other people commented on and if there's things that you missed. I think that for me helped hone the types of things I should be looking for in reviews. A more blunt metric is whether or not the decision was the decision that you recommended. So if you are always saying accept and half of them are getting denied, or if you're saying denied and those are getting accepted, I think that would also make you think about whether or not you're looking at it with the lens that the journal intends you to. And then I think it's not direct feedback. It's not necessarily knowing if you're doing it well, but for me, continuing to ask for help has been helpful. So it's not on the back end of is the review I submitted good? It's before I get there, hey, someone who really knows the field, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? And then you can provide a quality review after that.
Yeah, that's so true. Other metrics might be, simple things like writing a detailed review and submitting it on time, that goes very far, because actually the journals keep track on whether your reviews are late or whether you declined or accepted the review. And so there are a lot of marks that can be given just for consistency, because that's half the battle, knowing that if you ask somebody to do something that they execute, you may or may not agree, but they're going to give you a thoughtful opinion back. And the fact that you keep getting invited is also a good sign that you're potentially, you're doing a good job. I think I wanted to call out the article that you wrote, Kate, with George Koch in the Current Urology Reports about unlocking the peer review process and really outlining and diagramming out how residents can get involved, why it's important, why this fulfills like an ACGME requirement for residents to get involved in research in a different way. Do you want to talk a little bit about the framework that you laid out in the article of why the model for integration of peer review into resident education, kind of your vision for this?
Absolutely. I think as it stands, we're having this conversation now about me, a single resident, sending an email to the journal and then trying to find an attending to help me. And it's a bit of a fragmented process. It works and everyone's welcome to get involved, but there's not a system for it. So the question is, if this is a useful tool and it's good for residents to be involved, is there a way we can standardize it? And the thought is, if it were centered from the journals and journals coordinated with residency programs, there could really be a system where residents are invited and expected to provide reviews. And in return, residency programs recognize that essentially residents doing that are getting reps, practicing the research process, practicing going through literature regularly, and counting that towards the ACGME requirements for things like being involved with research or other academic activities. So the thought would be earlier in your residency, you start just like we've talked about with a mentor, one step at a time. They check that you're doing a good job, relieves some of those questions about, am I doing a good job and should I be reviewing it independently? It would also potentially give more education on things like statistics and methods if you're doing that one-on-one with a mentor. And so that would be the next step as you move up. Eventually, you could be doing reviews on your own. One thing I don't think we've mentioned yet is when you offer to be a reviewer, you can pick what topics you're willing to review. So especially like for me, moving into my senior years of residency or other folks who are planning on specializing, you can start to hone your expertise. And so you're reviewing things independently in a certain topic. And then lastly, like we certainly saw at my institution, you can start to mentor those below you. And I think when we have things like journal clubs, if people are regularly reviewing, they have articles that are already in their pocket and ready to go, it would create really easy opportunities to have more review of the literature as a group as well. So you're moving from, I'm doing this, but with help, to I'm doing this and I'm leading a conference on it.
That's awesome. And I think that's a great vision. And I think it's so true. And it is kind of a natural progression from the journal clubs that many residency programs host, where you're critiquing articles as a group and you're discussing it. And now you're getting involved in the peer review process is that next layer when you're critiquing something novel independently on your own. And while this vision has yet to be in practice, I think getting started, like you're saying, about contacting journals, engaging mentors, within the field, within the topics that appeal to you is a good place to start. But I certainly support this. And I encourage everyone to read this article because you lay out very clearly about how this is so much more tangible to get involved in the peer review process is, even more so easier than writing a manuscript to some degree because you're getting involved earlier, as you're saying, and you understand the process before you're actually like structuring your own independent research. So everybody should check this article out. What did I leave out? Anything more about the peer review process that I didn't ask you about? Any hidden pearls that you feel like you want to share?
I think there's one thing we didn't touch on that I could have just now about how formalizing a system of peer review would help is there's a wide variety in urology programs. And I keep saying, oh, just go to my mentor. I'm just going to walk down the hall and knock on their door and they're going to help me. Yeah. And that may not be true everywhere for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's a smaller program. Maybe it's not as academically focused. And that certainly doesn't mean that residents don't want to get involved. And I think people in general would be amenable and open to mentoring people from other institutions, but there's no formal system for that at this point. So if it were to go through the journals and people could be paired across institutions, it would potentially open the door for more folks to get involved as well.
That's a great point. Mentorship does open doors. I know that I am involved, obviously, with Gold Journal and the SWU section of Gold, and SWU has made a deliberate effort to kind of pair students with mentors and in some ways facilitate student involvement in the peer review process when appropriate. I think if you don't have a mentor, I think many national organizations can be helpful, or you can reach out to somebody who you admire in the field or have had, some interface or contact with, a subspecialty meeting, at a GERS meeting, or at a AUA meeting, or in a neighboring practice. So it requires more outreach, but it's possible. I think if anyone contacted me and said they were interested in getting involved, I would certainly give them advice, but that's certainly well taken. I want to leave some room because we haven't shared with the audience, but we actually met a couple years ago, 2020. Kate was one of our virtual sub-interns at Columbia. She left a lasting impression on us after doing an entirely virtual course. And so it's great to see you at this stage of your training. I know you have a lot of words of wisdom that you probably want to share with residents as they're going through their training. You're near the end of your training and really thinking about fellowship. what pearls of wisdom would you want to share with your peers about anything in residency training even outside the peer review process?
Sure. Yes. We've come a long way from although we're virtual here again, from COVID times and virtual sub-Is. I think, peer review is one way to get involved with academics. I think as a resident, as I mentioned, in my junior years, I spent a lot of time in the hospital and I wasn't thinking about this kind of thing. My advice would be, when you have the time, to remember why you went into urology and find something that fills up your cup. Maybe it's research, maybe it's not. Maybe it's wellness efforts, but other things that are related to work but aren't specifically clinical duties, that help you remember why you're there and what you're excited about. And I think that just makes all parts of residency better when you have something connected to it that you really care and are excited about.
That's so true. I think the why is important. Maintaining those interests outside of work are important, and then diversifying your work. And I think that's why this is important. You spoke about in the midst of your PGY2 year, you got involved in this. Probably it was more work, but it was different work, and exercise muscles maybe you hadn't been using. So keeping the work different and challenging yourself in different ways that are meaningful to you are so important. And then this is just one additional way to do that. So it's always great to see you, even if it's always virtual. This is
Yes.
These are all great pieces of advice, and I'm so glad that we can get this information out there to our listening audience. I enjoyed chatting with you, and I look forward to connecting with our listening audience for our next set of episodes on BackTable Urology, the resident edition. Signing out for now and wishing you all a great evening.
Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, make sure to follow, rate the podcast 5 stars, and share with a friend.
If you have any questions or comments, you can direct message us at _BackTable Euro on Instagram, X, or LinkedIn.
BackTable is hosted by Aditya Bagrodia
and Jose Silva.
Our audio team is led by Kieran Gannon, with support from
Aaron Bowles,
Josh McWhirter,
and Josh Spencer.
Design and digital marketing led by Brian Schmitz.
Social media and PR by Chi Ding.
Administrative support provided by Judy Dela Cruz.
Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.